Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second joint FSR NYU debate titled Electricity Transmission and the Energy Transition, Perspectives from Africa, Europe, and North America. So in today's session, we will discuss the challenges and strategies of electric transmission infrastructure within the global energy transition. So we will address the evolving dynamics of energy systems across three distinct regions, namely Africa, Europe, and the US. We also examine transmission bottlenecks to unlocking renewable resources, alternative transmissions methods, and the role of modern grid technologies in shaping our future energy landscape. So to help us navigate the topic and give us a very broad and comprehensive perspective on the issue, we first have Maria Robinson. She's director from the U.S. Department of Energy Grid Deployment Office. Hello, Maria. Welcome. We then have Rafael Soter, team leader, electricity infrastructure and regional cooperation, DG Energy. Good afternoon. And we should have shortly Amini Idris Adoum, Director, Infrastructure, Industrialization and Trade Directorate from the African Union Development Agency. After this first introduction, we will go then into the panel debate that is going to be moderated by Christoph Graf. Hello, Christoph, where representatives from the industry, the regulation, and the academia will enrich the debate. But now, without further delay, over to Maria.
Thank you so much for having me today. My name is Maria Robinson, and as mentioned, I have the honor of leading the United States Department of Energy Grid Deployment Office. So this is a brand new office that was set up in 2022, largely to focus on issues relating to the electric grid and specifically when it comes to transmission. So today we'll be going through a little bit of the work that we are doing as the United States government in order to continue to enhance, upgrade, and expand our electric grid. I think it is no surprise to the folks on this particular webinar that the United States, of course, really needs to vastly expand our transmission infrastructure here in the United States for a number of reasons, not least of which for reliability purposes, as well as meeting additional demand, be it from data centers or from new AI or from new manufacturing. And the United States also needs to continue to increase the flexibility of the electric grid, which is relatively old and is oftentimes unidirectional. And so our office leverages funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to deploy about $22 billion to strengthen and modernize the United States grid, as well as, and this is important, to catalyze some of the private sector investment that is needed in order to meet this particular moment. So we do this from the government perspective in three different major ways. One is focusing on maintaining existing assets on the grid that provide important resource adequacy and ancillary services. And so that's some critical generation sources, whether it is nuclear or hydroelectric power, on which the vast majority of the United States relies on for firm base power. And we are focused on making sure that the health of our electricity markets maintains its ability to be flexible to current needs. The second is that we are focused on deploying and catalyzing the development of that high-capacity electric transmission lines, acknowledging that in the United States, a significant amount of the existing transmission system is not actually high capacity. We have very little HVDC in this country, and most of which relies on much lower capacity lines. In addition, recognizing that the ever increasingly important role that distributed energy is playing in the United States electricity market, We also need to improve our distribution system so that the interplay between our transmission and distribution systems continues to strengthen, recognizing that there's an increased interest in different types of technologies, such as virtual power plants, in order to meet some of this increasing demand, at least in the interim time while we continue to work towards building additional transmission. Part of our overall goal here as well, although this is a little more on the distribution system, but certainly involves the transmission system, is preventing outages and increasing the resilience of the electric grid, recognizing that with increased weather events that we're seeing here in the United States, that being able to bounce back from those weather events is an important component of the grid. And our office is figuring out how to better deploy federal resources in order to ensure that we are preventing future outages, or at least minimizing them. So when it comes to transmission deployment in particular, we're looking at this from three perspectives. One is to increase the amount of planning that happens, in particular on the interregional planning perspective. While there are some robust regional planning mechanisms going on and set up in the United States, there's very little interregional planning that is happening, which reduces the overall efficiency of our ability to build on the grid, and also how flexible the grid can be, particularly during times of stress. The second approach is focusing on siting and permitting. We have an effort going on at the federal level where we will be rolling out later this month a program around coordinating federal permits, acknowledging that there are several different federal agencies that are involved in transmission permitting, and this will allow for the Department of Energy to be lead status on any federal permits that go through this process, to ensure that there is a single point of contact and minimizing the bureaucracy within the federal government. And the last area that we focus on is this commercial facilitation. We have a unique program here in the United States where the federal government, particularly our office, can enter into a capacity contract with a transmission line. And this is a really interesting new tool that was provided to us through the bipartisan infrastructure law, and allows us to help developers continue to move forward with some of their financing and development at a crucial period where they need someone to ensure that there will be offtake on a line, but at which stage many potential purchasers are not quite ready to enter into a formal contract. And this is a revolving fund that will give us the opportunity to continue to use this for future developments. So when we're talking about, let's talk about each of these three areas in particular. So on the planning side, we released last year the National Transmission Needs Study, which is a triennial report required by Congress that assesses all of the historical and future constraints and congestion from states and regional grid entities. And this will help to inform not only what the needs are over time, but helps to inform the federal government's own investments in transmission, including the designation of national interest electric transmission corridors. And so this helps to identify some of the major areas where there is significant economic and transmission congestion going on in the grid. As you can see in this slide, there's a significant amount of need across the entire country, and in particular around transfer capacity limits in between neighbors, which really shows up in basically almost every part of the 48 continental states. So we really want to ensure that there is a focus on that interregional planning, acknowledging that there is significant need all over the entire country, in addition to, of course, being able to provide some low-cost generation, such as wind and solar, to areas of high-price demand. We also have a nodal level study coming out later this year with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory that's going to identify some interregional and national strategies to really focus on where investment is necessary in order to maintain system reliability, as well as meet the president's ambitious goals. When it comes to siting and permitting, as I mentioned, we're working under this program that will coordinate federal authorizations and those related environmental reviews. When you're citing an interstate transmission line, this is under Section 216H of the Federal Power Act, which has been a very seldom used part of the Federal Power Act as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005's revisions. And so an MOU was issued last year, and a final rule will be issued relatively soon relating to this particular program. And so we look forward to having the ability to establish some schedules in preparation of a single environmental document for some of these massive projects. Again, this is some of the overview of this proposed rule, and particularly, I think what is important is between the notice of intent to the record of decision, it commits federal agencies to a 2-year environmental permitting review schedule, which is incredibly important and will increase the efficiency of this permitting and review process across the federal government. We also have the authority under Section 216A of the Federal Power Act to designate these national transmission corridors, which we are calling NTSCs for short. And so that designation is based on that need study that was referenced earlier. And after we make that designation, it unlocks some federal funding that would be available to some of the lines that are considered in the national interest, as well as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an independent body within the federal government, will then have the authority under a different section of 216 in the Federal Power Act to issue permits within a corridor in certain circumstances. So we're excited to be able to roll some of these out in the relatively near future as well. Finally, when it comes to commercial facilitation, as I mentioned, the federal government has this unique ability to enter into capacity contracts under a program that we call the Transmission Facilitation Program. We made some selections last year and are moving forward with 2 major lines, one between Nevada and Utah called Cross Tie, and one between Arizona and New Mexico called South Line. And so this will unlock a significant amount of new generation as well. We have already heard from the developers that this is allow them to move forward with some contracts with generation providers, as well as with other potential customers who now have the assurance of the federal government's involvement in these particular projects. We also have the ability to connect microgrids to the larger grid in Alaska, Hawaii, and the US territories through this particular program, and are looking forward to getting some responses on that area. So with that is in a very brief overview of some of the work that is going on here at the federal government level, and looking forward to further discussion from both other panelists and the audience at large. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. Very, very insightful and interesting. So we do have a question from the audience that maybe we want to address now before we move on to the European perspective with Raphael, and is from Pierre-Olivier Pinot. He's asking, how is Canada considered or included in the assessment plans? Are you coordinating, or each one is going to plan independently?
So definitely in the Northeast, and I would say in the Northwest, Canada interties are such a significant part of the discussion, and we are continuing to do more planning with them across those very important areas, especially to ensure for the facilitation of more hydropower moving north to south, and more renewables, other renewables moving south to north. This is something that we've explored both in the Northeast as well as in the Northwest. So I think it's really important for the 2 countries to be able to plan together. I think because of regulatory constraints, sometimes that can make it very difficult, because of course in the United States we only have jurisdiction over those parts that are in the United States, but that additional coordination is incredibly important. And I would also say that's true when we're talking about some of our discussions with our friends to the south in Mexico as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So now on to the European perspective with Rafael, please.
Thank you very much for having me as a speaker in this very interesting webinar. And many of the elements which Maria mentioned in the first presentation will also appear in my presentation, not surprisingly. But let me maybe start with the first kind of a state of play where we stand with the European transmission grid. It's a quite busy picture you can see here on the slide, which shows that in Europe we have a quite well developed interconnected electricity system, which is the backbone of our internal energy electricity market in Europe. So we start from a quite well developed system. But of course, we also face very similar challenges that have been mentioned earlier, which I've summarized in this slide. So overall, we in the Commission estimate that we have investment needs of nearly 600 billion euros by 2030 in order to meet the objectives, our policy objectives in terms of increase of renewables, to decarbonize our power system. And these investment needs relate not only to the expansion, but also to the modernization of the existing system that you've just seen, which is getting old in certain parts and needs modernization, and also on top of it, digitalizing the system. You also see here a differentiation between what is needed in the transmission grids, but also what is needed in the distribution grids, which is a very important component. So at the transmission level, we expect that we would need roughly a doubling of the cross-border capacity in Europe by 2030, which means that we would expect additional 23 gigawatt by 2025 and a further 64 gigawatt by 2030, as has been identified by the needs assessment by ENTSO-E, which would then help saving annually 9 billion of generation costs. In addition, we have very ambitious targets in terms of offshore renewables, over 300 gigawatt by 2030, which of course requires the necessary offshore grids to be in place, and the electrification of different sectors, including the industrial sector, with the needs in terms of the grid capacity. And then the distribution grids, which is less the topic of today's discussion, but it's an important component when we think of the renewables targets, and many of the, for example, solar capacity is expected to be connected to the distribution grid. And of course, also as an example, the electrification of the transport sector and the expected increase in heat pump deployment. So all of this constitutes huge challenges also for the electricity grid in Europe. And I will now explain in two blocks how we in Europe tackle these challenges. One is, first, I will explain you the existing framework we have in place to identify and support cross-border infrastructure projects in Europe. And in a second stage, I will explain the EU Grid Action Plan, which we published in November last year, which includes several short-term actions and measures to further accelerate the grid deployment in Europe in view of the challenges we're seeing here on this slide. So let me first explain the EU regulation on trans-European energy networks, in short, the 10E regulation, which is a legal framework in place since 2013 to help identifying what we call projects of common interest, and now also projects of mutual interest with third countries, which are projects of EU added value, cross-border projects that are considered priority projects, which we identify every 2 years with involvement of many stakeholders. And these projects then benefit from a number of benefits, which are here grouped in 3 blocks. The first one is an accelerated permit granting, which is very important in view of accelerating the deployment of these priority projects. The second benefits relate to the regulatory treatment of these projects. And here I would like to highlight the second block, which you can see here, which is the cross-border cost allocation, which is a very important tool for cross-border infrastructure projects, which are in different jurisdictions. And then, of course, one of the key questions is how to allocate costs and who pays for what, which part of the project, in view of the benefits the project generates. And this is a tool that allows this attribution of the costs with the involvement of the national regulatory authorities in the member states concerned. And the third block of benefits relates to financial support, which can be financial instruments, but also in justified cases, grants. We have a dedicated financing instrument here in the European Union, which is called the Connecting Europe Facility, where we can help financing projects that cannot be financed slowly by the market, which means mainly network tariffs. We have so far contributed around roughly 5 billion in support of projects of common interest. And we have in the current 7-year period, which we have here in the EU, a total budget of roughly 6 billion euros to support projects. The 10E framework, we have updated it recently in 2022 to make sure it fully contributes to the energy transition, to make sure that the cross-border infrastructure we're working on in this framework helps deliver on the 2030 targets under the European Green Deal. And here I have highlighted a couple of elements which I think are most relevant for our discussion. One is that we have now new and updated infrastructure categories. For example, I mentioned offshore renewables earlier. We have now a dedicated chapter on offshore grids, which includes also new categories such as hybrid projects, which are interconnectors connecting directly also offshore renewables. We have, for example, also updated the definition of smart electricity grids, which we consider extremely important in the energy transition, which is also relating to the distribution grids I mentioned earlier. We have also then enhanced regulatory and permitting provisions, and focuses also on the cross-sectoral energy infrastructure planning to make sure that the electricity planning is aligned, consistent with what is planned on the hydrogen side, given the increased focus on system integration. And the last point, we have also now a new project category, which is project of mutual interest with third countries, acknowledging the increasing role of interconnectors with non-EU member states. One key tool in our planning in this process to select projects of common interest is what we call here in Europe the 10-year network development plan, which is run by ENTSO-E, which is the European network of transmission system operators from the different member states. This is here reflecting the different steps that are being done in this biannual process, starting from definition of scenarios reflecting the policy objectives that need to be achieved and for which we need the grids. We then identify the needs, so the grid capacity that is needed to achieve these objectives. We have then project promoters submitting projects, which are then assessed in terms of their cost-benefit assessment, which then feeds into our 10E selection process. And the last slide on the 10E framework shows here our latest and first list of PCIs and PMIs that we have just published this week on Monday under the revised framework, which includes in total 85 cross-border electricity projects, of which 12 are offshore grid projects. and also 5 smart electricity grid projects. I think it's a bit difficult to see all the lines. I apologize for the contrast in color. It's not that great, but I hope it gives a reflection of the amount and location of the different projects. The green shaded areas are reflecting the smart electricity grid project. So it shows that we are responding here to the needs, and these projects can then benefit from the benefits I mentioned earlier. Let me then move to the second block, and I am aware of time, so I try to be short, which is the EU Grid Action Plan, which we published in November last year, which the title says it all. I think grids the missing link. So it really acknowledges the need that without transmission, there is no transition, as we often hear these days. And the action plan includes in total 14 actions that can be implemented within the next 18 months, involving different stakeholders and contributing to the 7 objectives, which you can see here on the slide, which is the accelerated implementation of the PCIs and PMIs I explained earlier. It's about better long-term grid planning. It's about improving the regulatory incentives for forward-looking grid build-out. It covers the better usage of the existing grids. It's about improving access to finance, which is a huge challenge given the huge investment needs TSOs and project promoters face. It's about the faster permitting and a better stakeholder engagement, which is very important in order to shorten the implementation times. And then the last point is strengthening the grid supply chain. And I would now, in the next few minutes before I close, give a bit more detail on the blue highlighted elements. First of all, on the improved long-term grid planning. What we, together with ENTSO-E, aim to do is to enhance the top-down planning towards 2050 to have a more forward-looking approach, building on our recent experience on offshore network development plans, which ENTSO-E has published earlier this year, and how these can be better integrated in the overall TY-NDP process, and in particular the system needs, what I explained earlier. A second important element on grid planning is then on the DSO level, how grid planning can be improved at the DSO level, also in view of the interlinks with the transmission level, because the transmission level, of course, needs to respond what is going on the distribution level to make sure both are well integrated. On the regulatory incentives for a forward-looking grid build-out, one key action is on anticipatory investments in grid projects. So how do we make sure that investments that are needed in the future in view of, for example, the renewables build-out, how do we integrate these future needs in investment decisions today? And here we work also closely with ACER, and I see Jan, who is also joining the debate later on. And the second point here is that we are preparing a guidance on cross-border cost sharing for offshore projects, which builds on what I mentioned earlier in the 10E framework, which is the cross-border cost allocation as a very important tool to allocate cost and make the projects feasible. The last slide on the actions on the grid action plan is the better usage of the grids. And this is, first of all, an action to define in a harmonized way what is available grid hosting capacity for system operators, and establish a pan-EU overview on where is grid hosting capacity available to get a better, higher degree of transparency. Another element is on promoting the uptake on smart grid, network efficiency, and innovative technologies to make sure we use the grids as efficiently and in an optimized way as possible. And the third element to mention here is that ACER in its next tariff report will recommend best practices on the promotion of smart grids and network efficiency technologies, looking particularly on the question on the OPEX and CAPEX consideration in this specific context. So let me conclude here. Just I hope the presentation could convey the message that regional cooperation is key in advancing cross-border infrastructure projects and in planning them. The 10E framework has helped to complete nearly 100 cross-border projects, and many are being implemented at the moment. And there is the need to move faster and further and to bring the different dimensions together: onshore, offshore, electricity and hydrogen, transmission and distribution, and also the national and the cross-border level. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Very comprehensive. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A box, which I'm really happy about. But maybe I could just ask one now, and then we leave the rest for later on. So this one is from Nicola Rossetto, is about more public funding needed to support the massive deployment of the grid by 2030. So do you think that this will be possible over the next 6 years, or what are your views on this?
It's a very important question, and I think if we look at the investment needs, the question is, of course, how can we finance them? And I mentioned network tariffs as the default way to finance grids in Europe. But this has, of course, also then implication on the network tariffs for consumers, being it private citizens, but also businesses, of course. And this is something to be considered when we think of how these investments can be financed. And it also then relates exactly to the question on the available public funds, not only at EU level, but also at national level. I mentioned the Connecting Europe facility, which has played a very important role in stepping in for PCIs when financing through network tariffs was not possible. And I do think that this will continue to play an important role. But at the same time, of course, we need to be aware on the constraints on public finances in general. And we will see for the next MFF, which is the multi-annual financial framework discussions, which is for the new commission, which role and how much money will be allocated to cross-border infrastructure projects.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you, Rafael. So now on to Africa. We have a slight change of speaker, so I'm going to present him to you. So we have Simbini Tikakunda. He's Principal Program Officer Energy at the African Union Development Agency. So I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll be making this presentation on behalf of our director, Amin Idrissa Doum, who unfortunately could not attend due to other constraints. So let me share my screen so that I can then go through the presentation that we've made for this, which talks about Africa's perspectives. So we have, as the African continent, over the past few years, 4 years, we've been working on the Continental Power Systems Master Plan, which was supported by the European Union, mainly supported by the European Union and other partners, which include the African Development Bank, USAID, IRENA, and IAEA. And so that master plan was adopted last year through what we call a specialized technical committee of the African Union responsible for infrastructure and energy. And it was then adopted as by the heads of state during the February summit this year as the flagship Agenda 2063 project. And also this year, the heads of state adopted the Agenda 2063 second 10-year implementation plan. And consequent to that, they also then adopted this Continental Power Systems Master Plan to be the flagship project that will drive the electricity aspirations of that Agenda 2063 second 10-year implementation plan. And in developing the Continental Master Plan, we're obviously guided by the long-term objectives of developmental aspirations in Agenda 2063, which calls for an ambitious development scenario which will enable the African Union member states to attain at least middle income status by 2033. And in our case, in our focus, we then projected that to be up to by 2040. But we were guided by this continental developmental aspiration. And so consequently, what we did was all of the projections that I'll show you later are meant for us to enable the countries to graduate from their current income level to the next income level. And so we had to do a comparison between the baseline and the aspirations. And the baseline showed that if we were to continue with business as usual, most of member states will not be able to meet that developmental aspiration. And the other thing that we also guided by was SDG 7, the goal of attaining universal access by 2030. And we also, from our projections, were able to demonstrate that what the member states were planning, we will not be able to meet that goal by 2030, but rather we came up with a plan where the member states could reasonably be able to meet that by 2035. So for us to be able to do that now, in terms of to meet the projected demand for us to meet those two developmental aspirations as dictated by Agenda 2063 as well as the SDG 7. We project that the continent will need to grow its current power generation capacity of 263 gigawatts to about 1,200 gigawatts by 2040. Of this, about 65% will have to come from renewable energies if we are to do it cost effectively, which translates to about 763 gigawatts. And you can see from the graphs that this will mainly come from wind, solar, as well as hydro, as well, and some battery energy storage and other renewable energies. And the gas will also continue to play its significant part as a transition fuel. But for us to be able to do this, we then looked at where these sources of energy would mostly come from. And we looked at the 5 regions on the continent, which are made up of the 5 power pools on the continent. And for example, this graph shows you that the East African power pool, in addition to being a major source of wind and hydro, it will also be a major source of exports into the interconnected continental grid on the continent. And then for the Southern African power pool, which will remain to be dominated by coal, but we'll also see some significant growth in terms of wind and solar and hydro. It will then have to be one of the regions that will have a lot of the imports coming from the other regions. And you'll see later on in the map that I will show you in terms of where the demand as well as the supply will come from in the interconnected grid on the continent. So in terms of investment, we project that for the continent, for us to meet these development aspirations, we will need about 1.3 trillion investment by 2040, of which about 35 billion will be required for the interconnectors that are needed for us to develop what we call an Africa single electricity market. And this is also in line with the presentation that was made by the previous presenter, that without investment in transmission, we cannot see this kind of investment or growth in or penetration in the renewable energies that we projected previously. And this will only be possible if we do regional integration across the continent, and then if we also then create an Africa single electricity market. But the opportunity costs of not going that route are that for us to meet the same objectives, we will need double the amount of investment, which is about $2 trillion assuming that we don't have the interconnected grids, we don't have the regional markets, each member state is investing to meet its own energy security, we will need about $2 trillion. So it makes economic sense for us to go this route where we have interconnected regional grids, which are then integrated into a continental grid. So as a continent, we are working on establishing the Africa single electricity market in 3 stages. Currently, we are in the 2nd stage now, where we are aiming to have market opening by 2030, and then full market operation by 2040. And in order to do this, as I mentioned, that we have identified the key infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure that will enable do that. And we have quantified the amount of electricity trade that can take place between the power pools and within the power pools and between the power pools. And we project that the regions such as the Central African Power Pool, which is home to our largest hydropower potential on the continent, as well as the East African Power Pool, will be the regions that will be supplying most of the energy in terms of the exports. But where the demand will be in this interconnected grid, there will be the demand will be mainly centered around the Southern African Power Pool and the West African Power Pool. And the size of the market will be, we estimate that in terms of the power trading that can be taking place between the power pools, we estimate that will be in the region of about 135 billion by 2040, and by 2040. And we've gone further to look at how that the development of that grid could look like in terms of the progressive development of the grid. So we have identified the key infrastructure that we need to be put in place by 2025. These are transmission lines that member states are already working on, that are advanced in terms of either under construction or that are under a project preparation. And by 2025, from these existing transmission lines that are either committed or existing, we estimate that by 2025 we have an interconnected grid between these, which connects the Southern African Power Pool to the East African Power Pool and to the Northern African Power Pool, which is Comelec. But these transmission lines will be weak, and the capacities the transfer capacities will also be very low. But by 2035, this will improve slightly, and we will be able to interconnect the 3 power pools that I mentioned. That is the Southern African Power Pool, Central East African Power Pool, Comelec, all the way to up by 2035, by 2030. And by 2040, we will then have the full integrated continental grid with sufficient transfer capacities between the power pools, so that we can then have the estimated renewable energy penetration and be able to sustain the capacities that I presented earlier on. And this will come mainly from the existing transmission lines, the committed transmission lines, the candidate transmission lines that the member states have identified, and then some of the generic interconnectors that we have recommended as part of the modeling that we have done as through the Continental Power Systems Master Plan development. And by 2040, what we'll be having is a single electricity market across the continent. And this will also enable us to trade power between the continent as well as with Europe and the Middle East through the existing transmission lines, as well as those that are underdeveloped, mainly through Med-TSO, and then also through the interconnectors that are being constructed through between Egypt and the Middle East. Currently we are at the bridging phase, where we are working with our partners to mobilize resources now, so that we can then be able to start the implementation stage, where we will be doing we will be implementing it in 2 pillars, which is continuing to build capacity in long-term energy planning that is focused on building capacity within the member states, as well as preparing the preparation of the priority projects. And this year we are working with our partners also to organize an energy summit where we will then present these results and then hopefully get some commitments in terms of mobilizing resources for this next phase. And during this phase as well, this is the heads of state have already adopted the AFSEM and the Continental Power Systems Master Plan as a flagship program of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. So what are we going to do in the next phase in terms of how we see the implementation of this plan? So the first thing that we'll be doing is to work with the power pools to bring them to the same operational level. As you would appreciate that we have 5 power pools on the continent. Of these 5, the most advanced is the Southern African Power Pool, as well as the West African Power Pool, which launched their power trading last year. And they also have regional regulatory authorities. Yeah, and as I showed you in my presentation earlier on, that we think that the Central African Power Pool and the East African Power Pool are going to be critical in terms of generating some of the exports that we see in these markets. So between now and 2030, we'll be working with them so that we capacitate them and work with them to bring them to the same operational level as the Southern and West African Power Pool. And in addition as well, so which means that as a minimum, all of them should have the same regional electricity markets, where you can have the day-ahead, month-ahead market, day-ahead market, as well as the intraday market. But in order for us to be able to mobilize the kind of resources that we're looking at, we are working with piloting 3 markets that we think are going to be essential for facilitating the penetration of renewable energies, deepening the liquidity of these markets, as well as diversifying the sources of financing that we are that we need to be able to attract investment for these the quantum of investments that we're looking at. The first one is working with to have renewable energy markets, where we will then be able to develop a market where member states and developers can trade in renewable energy certificates. And this will help us to respond to mechanisms such as the European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, especially for those of our industries that are export-oriented. And then the second market is establishment of a carbon market, where we will then be able to trade the carbon emission reductions that will emanate from the investment in renewable energy. And this will help us to have national, intra-regional, as well as transcontinental trading in carbon. And the third most important market is electricity trading financial markets, where we will have 2 sets of instruments, financial derivatives to de-risk investment in renewable energy and power generation, as well as other investments, which would enable us to mobilize domestic resources and then attract investment from the private sector. And some of the examples you can see in my slide. So currently, in terms of the long-term energy planning, we have mobilized sufficient resources now to work with each of the power pools to align their regional master plans and to update their master plans in line with the Continental Power Systems Master Plan. So we'll be working with the Central African Power Pool to update their regional master plan. We are collaborating with the East African Power Pool, IRENA, IAEA, and the World Bank to see if we can build capacity in long-term energy planning for their member states in that region. We are working with our partners also to mobilize resources for the update of the regional master plans for the Southern African Power Pool and the West African Power Pool, as well as the Northern African Power Pool, the POMELEC. And the second component, which is quite critical and very important, is that I will not go into the details of this slide, but just to mention that we are working with the power pools to make sure that we establish mechanisms that help us to develop a predictable pipeline of bankable projects. And for us, as you have seen, that the size, the ambitions that we have in terms of the investment in power generation as well as transmission, they require for us to have a paradigm shift in terms of how we support the development of these priority projects. And these mechanisms are very critical for us in making sure that at least one, we reduce the time it takes for us to prepare a project from an average of about 6 to 8 years to about 3 years. We also reduce the transaction costs. We also are able to produce a predictable pipeline of bankable projects, which is what our financiers and our partners will be looking for. So in terms of how we'll be implementing the different components that I've just presented to you, that is the components under Pillar 1 and Pillar number 2, AUDA will continue to work with all of the stakeholders on the continent to coordinate to make sure that all of these different components are implemented in tandem. And then we'll be working with the power pools, the regional economic communities, and other partners to implement the different components, which will be implemented, some at continental level, some at regional level, as well as some at power pool level. So in conclusion, I think just also to reinforce what has just been said, what the Continental Power Systems Master Plan has demonstrated is that we cannot have that transition without investment in transmission. And in the context of the African, in the African context, we need to build strong partnerships so that we can then be able to mobilize sufficient resources to prepare this pipeline of bankable projects on time and at scale, and also to then be able to finance these projects. We also need to develop new financial instruments that help us to broaden the capital base for us to be able to attract the necessary quantum of funding that we need to develop this Africa single electricity market. And finally, let me invite those of you who may be interested to work with us to come and partner with us as we start now to move on to this implementation phase, which will start later on this year up to 2030. So we invite you to partner with us in implementing this ambitious program that we have set out for ourselves as the African continent. And thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to make this presentation.
Thank you very much, Dick. It was a very fascinating and ambitious plan you have presented for Africa. So I'm sure there is a lot of food for our panelists now to discuss this further. So I'm foreseeing a very interesting debate, and I'll leave the floor to Christoph now.
Thank you so much, Marcia. My name is Christoph Graf. I'm a senior economist at Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. And I'm excited to have like three excellent panelists. This is Rob Gramlich, president from Grid Strategies LLC, who knows the consulting and business world around transmission in and out. We have Federico Pontini, technologist for energy transition director at Fondazione Enrico Mattei in Milan. We have Jan Kostevich, team leader, energy infrastructure from ACER, which is the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators in Europe. I would like to start with Rob to give like his perspective, and I'd assume it will be US-centric and a little bit of a reply, maybe also to Maria, but maybe you also want to talk about something else that's going on in the US and that we all kind of look forward to.
Sure, thank you. Three very interesting presentations. I do focus mostly on the U.S. Transmission system and bulk power markets to enable low-cost decarbonization, and that steers me and our firm Grid Strategies towards transmission, really first and foremost. And it sounds like there's a lot of agreement across the three continents here. On the need for transmission. I wrote a piece a few years ago saying there's no transition without transmission, and I don't know who said that first, but it's great to hear it from multiple continents now, as well as the addressing of what we like to call the 3 Ps, planning, permitting, and paying. It sounds like everybody has the same physics and economics and have to deal with those issues. The institutions and laws are a little different, and I follow very closely all of the laws and regulations that Maria talked about. I think the Grid Deployment Office and Maria are doing a fantastic job. with the tools they have here in the U.S. I would note for those who maybe don't follow the U.S. very much that historically the Department of Energy has done very little in transmission or even the power sector. Their authorities are minimal. And it's really just all of this, everything she described is very recent. So the fact that there's even the word deployment in a Department of Energy function is a completely new idea here in the United States. We've had state and federal economic regulators, and they approve plans, usually utility generation plans with a little bit of transmission. But we are in a new mode now. I think there's much more recognition that we really rely on regional networks that cross many states. And so there's much more of a need for active work by both the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is our national economic regulator, as well as the Department of Energy. And so the creation by Secretary Granholm of the Department of Energy of this new office and appointment of Maria and her team, her now significantly sized team that has all grown from 0 to however many people they are, is all new. And some of those programs are very new and not really tested yet. But so it's really important, I think, for the U.S. to get those programs in place. They're doing a really good job, as I said, getting them and staffing them up. But, we don't really know the full extent or impact that that's going to have. When we talk about transmission plans here, there's a lot of reports that are called transmission plans, but sometimes they're somewhere between dreams and studies, but not really plans. So the Department of Energy can't require a plan. They can't direct anybody to build something, and neither can FERC. FERC is about to issue a rule. We think it'll come out this month or next, directing all of the utilities in the country to have a forward-looking 20-year multi-purpose transmission plan. And that's extremely important, in my opinion. In fact, I think that's the most important energy policy in the country here. And so I'm hopeful that will come out and will be a strong motivation. But you should note that is a directive for others to plan and to use certain planning methodologies. It's not the actual, it's not creating a plan and directing people to execute it. It's directing people to go do the planning and to execute it. And we have 330 or so transmission owners around the country, some of whom are not even jurisdictional, many of whom are not even jurisdictional to FERC, and over whom Department of Energy has little authority either. So we wrestle with this federalism idea here. There's increasing talk about boosting our interconnectors, as they are called in Europe, and it sounds like Africa as well. We call that interregional planning, or the minimum transfer capacity requirement. There's been a bill in Congress that got a lot of attention, and now a study by NERC, our reliability regulator, is underway, and FERC is likely to undertake a proceeding on that interregional. But those are all sort of interstate, interim stages of development of that idea. We're borrowing from NSOE and some of the work in Europe on that, and hoping to get there. But it's early stages here. We don't know if we'll be able to implement that. So there's a lot of talk and interest here in the U.S. I'll just wrap up at a high level, and exciting new developments from the Department of Energy that are important but new and not really implemented fully yet, and strong proposals from FERC, and then strong bills in Congress that are bills and not laws. So I'd say we're really just still in the early stages of putting national and regional transmission policies in place. And the last point I forgot to mention about Department of Energy, all of the financing tools that Maria mentioned, again, are great, but the dollar amount is really tiny relative to the need. They have, you can count it differently. I count it as around $5 billion, $5 to $10 billion for new transmission lines. A lot of their dollars are for bolstering the resilience of the existing lines, not really new lines. And even the transmission facilitation program she mentioned is essentially a type of a loan rather than a grant, so that the money goes back. So the dollars are not great. We do not have a lot of federal support at this time for transmission. So again, a lot of interest, proposals, a lot of talk, but not really firm plans yet. Outside of a couple regions, we can talk about regions of the country. The Midwest and California are doing better than others, but not a lot of firm action at the federal level to get interregional, large-scale, long-distance transmission.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. I think it might make sense if we move to Jan now to kind of contrast the European experience to the US experience, and maybe also relating to the coordination problem that Rob just mentioned. But also we had a question from the audience talking about if offshore grid is easier to develop because there's less social acceptability issues. Maybe you have an opinion on that too, or generally what are the main obstacles in the permitting procedures from your point of view? Jan, please.
Yeah, thanks. You gave quite a broad perspective of what I could maybe present on. And it is the problem of all of these discussions is that it's very complex, right? So the scale of change, which is ahead, well, not actually ahead, but we are in it right now, is so huge that it's really difficult to comprehend. I mean, in Europe we have, as mentioned by Rafael, I mean, hundreds of gigawatts of wind power and solar power being introduced into the system. If that doesn't mean, those figures don't mean a lot to you, I mean, one typical nuclear power plant is less than a gigawatt. So it's hundreds of nuclear power plants being, it's huge. Plus, of course, these are not nuclear power plants. This is not a stable generation source. It's a source which is intermittent, and you have to deal with this intermittency. So flexibility is a big issue, how to deal with this flexibility and all that. Maybe to try to first answer the questions on the permitting and offshore developments and stuff like that. In theory, yes. I mean, we do not have yet sufficient evidence to claim that it's easier to develop offshore grids. It has its own complexities, especially because it's done between countries. So that is an additional complexity. But in theory, of course, it could be easier because you will have less people objecting it, right? Which is often one of the bigger issues when doing things onshore. But I think, the scale of all of this, again, is huge. And one of the issues that I see, that in the past, how we faced any sort of development things was, well, you have the typical dancing pair of the regulator and the system operator, right? The regulated entity. And you expect them to sort of dance the problem away, right? Here, I think, the pace is a bit too quick for this dance. It's first of all, within this dance, it's quite difficult to see who leads and who follows often. Unfortunately, I mean, the relationship between the regulated entity is a very complex one. So this is one thing which of course I would expect or hope that it would be solved in the future, because it needs to be solved. You need a more sort of strict governance. You cannot have the regulated entity to a large extent running everything, and the regulator being sort of put in the shadow of these developments, and then expect the regulator to do his job, even though maybe they were not put in the front seat for many years before. So first of all, again, going to this huge scale, right? In the past we said, look, we don't want policy and politics to get too involved into this. I mean, it works well if it's a stable development of the system. And that's how, this cooperation was set up. So you have the regulator trying to, regulate the monopoly, and the monopoly, of course, doing their job of maintaining the system operating at 50 hertz. And that was it, quite a simple task. Of course, then you had the market walking in and had to grow also that, and still it was a relatively doable task. But now we have this huge paradigm shift, and again, the two may not be sufficient, especially not in the way that they are currently dancing. So policy actually, I think, is a needed thing that needs to sort of step in and make some concrete changes. Now, this, of course, I would hope that this would be done in a smart way, and not in a way that, we see often politicians do, maybe not fully informed, but then they take a decision which is maybe likable to many, but it might not be particularly doable in reality. So these are a bit the things that we are dealing with here. But what I also see, maybe just to sort of wrap things up in the future system, that it truly cannot be just a system comprised of many specific systems, like the transmission system, distribution system, the consumers, the producers, and all that. I think everything is sort of becoming more interlinked, if we say it like that. We are for sure sort of heading, or should be heading, towards a system of systems, as many start to call it, meaning that these subsystems need to start cooperating and coordinating amongst themselves. And that also means the consumers, right? So how do you incentivize the consumers to do something like that? We are just at the beginning of that. So demand-side management, flexibility coming from demand-side management is at its infant stage. So this is for sure something that we are strongly looking into through tariffs, also through incentives, even though incentives are more targeting the behavior of the system operators. But we as ACE are looking into those two fields sort of mostly, predominantly. Of course, not leaving aside network planning, trying to have a good oversight to make it a balanced network plan that takes all these actions into account. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jan. Before I'd like to move to Federico, I'd like to ask Simbini, because what I'm kind of hearing from Jan, but I also in the US context, I feel there is a lot of political uncertainty also, because we are talking about very long-term investments that have long lead times. And we have like government circles that are short, and there is like a risk that things will be planned today and will be undone tomorrow. And we had a question from the audience for Simbini, asking how he sees the government's challenge for African countries to build a continental grid. I mean, here also like kind of political uncertainties at play. What do you think would be like a good model to deliver the job to build out a grid for the African continent?
No, thank you, Christoph. Yes, I think we also grapple with that political uncertainty, given the short term of most governments. So we, as a continent, the fact that this initiative has been adopted as a flagship program for Agenda 2063, it gives us that long-term perspective and commitment for successive governments, to the attainment of that goal. And then it's also aligned to the continental drive to increase intra-Africa trade through the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And through this Africa Single Electricity Market, this will then be increasing intra-Africa trade in electricity. So from that perspective, we have that long-term commitment of the governments. But on a more project scale, that is why we are saying that for these priority projects, we need to reduce the time it takes for us to prepare a project and to bring it to market from 6 to 8 from 6 to 8 years, because within that time span, a lot of governments would have changed and a lot of decision makers would have, the priorities would also change. And we have broken down the implementation into phases of 3 years so that we can then be able to move priority projects within those short-term phases of 3 years, so that we can then have the right decision made during that short period and then move on to the next priority list of projects. So that's how we are trying to address those challenges there.
Okay, thank you. Finally, I would like to ask Federico to give his view. I hope he has like the technological solution to all our problems. I look forward to your discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So I was more into the regulation part, but
I was thinking because you're like the technologies for energy transition director. But
I know. Yeah. So no, let's say let me address at least a couple of regulatory issues. Then of course I speak also to some technical and technological aspects. So the first one is that we have with the master plan, we are talking about the future, and I want to talk a little bit more about the present. And I think that there is one big challenge to address, which is how to get finance. And of course, we were talking about bankability. I think that we need to specify what bankability means in Africa right now, is that these projects are accepted and financed by international organizations and donors. Why? Because all projects in transmissions right now are financed only through donors and international financial institutions. So it means that they cost very little in terms of interest. Either sometimes they are grants or they are 0 to 1% interest rate and concessional loans. And so they have to demonstrate that they provide big economic returns, so social welfare, not really finance. So making profitable investments that can attract private investors means for many African countries increase dramatically the cost of capital, because it would mean providing 10 to 15% return on those investments. Okay, so we need to understand when this is worth it. Because basically you are giving away lengthy procedures that, on the other hand, bring you low-cost concessional loans to more market-based investments that, on the other hand, come with very high cost of capital. And in some regions and in some cases, this might be true, but this is a big challenge to address, and it is important to bear in mind, because also in generation, it is difficult to attract private investments because of this trade-off between low-cost capital and long-term capital. As for rules that then also pertain to many technological aspects and governance, the issue is that right now, so the backbone of this continental master plan is the different power pools, but the different power pools are at a very different stage of development. Only some power pools have a good governance, and most of the time, the regulators within those power pools, they lack of real enforcement. And but things are improving, and even when it comes to technical and technological aspects, we see now that grid codes are finally being adopted at regional level, and that finally codes can be then translated into national procedures, and that finally some accountability is coming. So, for instance, we have now the synchronization of the West Africa power pool. We have finally a coordination center, which can still not act as a system operator, but it at least provides an overview in real time of the grid. But again, in order to have further integration and further trade, we need to invest more in technologies, because as of now, the West African power pool only has visibility to less than 40% of the grid, because they lack SCADA, they lack WAMS, and so they cannot really operate at full capacity. And the third one that I was talking about, the third issue is absolutely about trust and political aspects. And that also brings sometimes more costly solutions. So also from a technological point of view. So the preferred option in Africa is HVDC lines now for interconnections, because they don't require full synchronization. And so on the one hand, they are good because they enable trade. On the other hand, they are more expensive, and they are needed because we want to keep bilateral trades and not further integration. So all these things must be absolutely addressed if we want to deliver not just transition, because in Africa it's not just a matter of transition, but more importantly, it's a matter of energy access and energy affordability. So I hope that I touched both the regulatory and technological aspects. Thank you.
Absolutely, that was great. Thank you. With that, I'm giving to Andres to summarize the debate today.
Well, I think there was already quite clear that grids are crucial to transition. But I will perhaps in this debate summarize some elements. One was perhaps touch less. It is political attention towards the grids. Because usually grids are seen as at least from political point of view, is necessary evils that you need to do to make transition. Its grids are not being seen as critical elements for improving quality of life or increasing competitiveness. I think that is where the political debate is somehow going in the wrong direction, because grids, if you try to present that you need to build grids to get more renewable energy in, usually will backfire. So you really need grids to strengthen the quality of life and make more competitiveness. I think that is one thing that still need to be taken. Saying said this, it's definitely more and more in political debates there is better understanding. But as long as it does not go in this way, you will be always vulnerable for new regulatory measures or new projects, because there will be enormous opposition as well. So I think that is one issue that need to be dealt with. I believe one issue that is on all three continents are going very well, in my mind, it's grid planning. This is going reasonably well. We see studies in US, in EU, we have 10-year development plans. We have a lot of developments on this side, continental master plan. So there is a lot of events, and they go in the right direction. There is no question about it. Permitting and siting is also improving. It is still a challenge, but there is more and more understanding how to sort it out, how to deal with this. The two difficult issues that stand out is governance and financing. I think with governance, it's very much individual. Definitely each continent is different. There's no question about it. But governance issues at the end of the decide how much cost society will pay for the grids, how they will be used, how they will be understood, how fast they will be developed. So I think some of the recent studies have already indicated that usual perceptions that grid main problem is integration of renewable energy is less of a problem. It's actually the governance that is a problem. So I believe a lot of more work on studies and also support is needed to really to find the best form of governance, particularly taking into what Jan was saying. At the end of the day, you have many systems. You will have integration of systems, and the complexity of the whole system could be managed only by good governance. So you need to evolve in the governance. You can't stay with the governance that we have now. You need to anticipate what governance should respond to very much developed grids that are integrating the best technology. And if it is not sorted out, there will be always delays and difficult issues. And financing, there are a lot of good ideas on EU cross-border allocation costs. There are also 10E instrument. On US, I liked very much this fund for the new lines that there is offtake. I think for Africa, it would be great, because in Africa, we'll definitely to build a power line on commercial grounds would be very difficult. If you have some type of revolving fund just on grants, it would be very difficult, and there will be no offtake from the day one. So it's really good instrument, and these perhaps instruments that have been developed in US or in Europe could be looked upon, perhaps with some adjustments. It could be applied more broadly, because at the end of the day, there always is scrutiny on financing, and the instruments that are being proposed usually have in mind attracting private investment. So there is, some are more successful, some are less, but the basic ideas are there, and I believe debates on these grounds could be very, very fruitful. And I would need to conclude to thank Maria, Rafael, and Tish for great presentations and for fantastic work that you are doing, and a lot of success to you. For Rob, Jan, and Federico for excellent comments that you brought all the complexity and challenge with the grids, and for Christoph and Marcia for fantastic sharing. I believe that we need to come back to the issues, perhaps separating some particular issues, not to trying to speak about grids in all the complexity. It just takes some issues, financing or governance, or even planning, that I am saying going quite well. But I believe without strong developments of societies understanding, research communities developments, and also practical examples on the ground, energy transition will be less dynamic and less successful, and there is plenty to be done. And I believe that we really also need to help society to develop more healthy views towards the grids. Grids are not just costs. Grids are absolute necessity for better quality of life. And if we can manage this understanding, that people will try to look on these issues differently, and there will be also more good solutions coming from political side. So thank you for all the speakers, and thank you for audience for joining us today. Thank you and goodbye.